Hello, how are you?
I'm great. It's so nice to be with you here tonight and to celebrate your debut. And I'm
Yes.
so excited especially to celebrate an Asheville author and an Asheville book, a book that takes place in Asheville, and we need more of those. And so this is wonderful. Thomas and I know each other through Mountain Express, and also, something that you and I haven't talked about is that we both have a little bit of Texas in us as well. So we
Mhm.
can talk about that later. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and how it came to be, and then we can we can hear from you and you can read something for us. But first, tell
Awesome.
us, what is The Wind Under the Door and where did it come from?
Sure. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you participating. As I mentioned, I love your short story collection, Fuckface. It's one of my favorites. So it's a huge deal to have you. And thanks, Malaprops, for hosting, because I love Malaprops. It was my grandmother's favorite bookstore. So it means a lot. So yeah, The Wind Under the Door, I'll just pull it up right there. It started as a short story in grad school at the University of Houston. I was working on another novel, but then I was taking a forms class with writer Robert Boswell, and he just mentioned that the two characters in that short story, they weren't done with each other. And I'm a huge fan of Boswell's work. So when I heard that, it kind of lingered. And then I just decided to start, exploring it as a novel. And yeah, it evolved, and it's about this guy Ford Carson. He's an artist in Asheville, North Carolina, and his estranged 18-year-old son is about to come visit him from California. His son's this semi-pro surfer. But before he arrives, Ford meets this woman, Grace Burnett, who's from Texas, from Houston. And there's kind of a mystery behind who she is, and they develop this relationship. She's married, kind of contemplating leaving her husband. And Ford kind of becomes infatuated with her, and his focus kind of shifts more on her than on the son. And then it's kind of this perfect storm of personalities coming together. Um, I think that answers everything, maybe.
Yeah, and a storm is a great way to describe it. Just the well, we can get into this later. The emotion and the crossing love paths and all that kind of stuff. So why don't you read for us a little bit so that people at home can get a sense of the book, and then we can talk about it.
For sure. When I say all that, and I should mention the section I'm reading is actually some backstory about Ford and his ex-wife. A lot of the story is also kind of Ford coping with the fact that he's been divorced for 10 years. Again, he's got this estranged relationship with his 18-year-old son. And he's realizing once his boy hits 18, his relationship with Emily, his ex-wife, might change. They might just be done with each other because they don't have that unit to work together with. So he's kind of coping with that as well throughout the novel. And I'm going to read a section about he and Emily's early relationship. And it's going to be, about a 5-pager for those who aren't used to readings and are like, how long is it going to go? So here we go. All righty. They had been each other's first, and like all firsts, they shouldn't have extended beyond high school, but they had, even after Emily moved 5 hours north to study English in Gainesville. Oh, and the backstory takes place in Florida, by the way. So we're in Florida right now. They initially took turns visiting each other until Emily's workload impeded her travels. Ford tried convincing her to get the books on tape to listen to on her drive down the turnpike. I'm not up here reading John Grisham novels, she informed him. I didn't say you were. You don't respect what I do. Yes, I do, Ford said. You do what? I respect what you do. I couldn't do it. What couldn't you do? Read all those books. They briefly split up that spring. Ford drank a lot and thought about dating, but held out hope that they would get back together, that what they needed was just what she'd claimed, space. Emily had other plans. Ford had met his replacement, a pretentious little bastard with a real hard-on for the word kitsch, at a party prior to their split. At the time, Ford didn't know what kitsch meant. Emily did, or at least she laughed each time Kitsch Boy said it. Eventually, Ford laughed too. This, no doubt, had been Kitsch Boy's plan all along. What's so funny? Kitsch Boy asked. It was late. The party was dying down. What you said, Ford answered. Why is it funny? Kitsch Boy insisted. Because it's true. What's true? It's very kitsch, Ford said. What's kitsch? Everything on that table. No, Kitsch Boy said. I mean, literally, what does kitsch mean? Ford thumbed the lip of his beer bottle. You don't know what it means. It means go fuck yourself, Ford said. Jesus, Ford, Emily whispered. Kitsch Boy laughed before wishing Emily a good evening. That's how he said it too, good evening. He then looked at Ford and shook his head, offering a contemptuous huff. Ford charged him. He could still see the transformation from the smug to the terrified. Kitsch Boy had been raised on a promise that if you kept a certain class of friends, you could patronize and critique to your heart's content without the slightest fear of a true human response. That had always been Ford's issue with Emily's college friends. They could theorize every aspect of life. They could deconstruct and reference the esoteric, but they didn't know shit. Emily was horrified. She thought Ford had smashed his beer bottle over Kitsch Boy's head. In reality, Kitsch Boy had nicked his forehead on the doorknob as he fell back. And if there's one thing a head's good for, it's bleeding. So it bled, and Emily yelled, and another partygoer helped Kitsch Boy up, and Emily took him to the hospital. Ford stayed behind. The party's host insisted that he leave, but Ford had nowhere to go. He ended up sleeping on the couch. At 5 a.m, Emily woke him. By then, he'd forgotten about the entire fracas, forgot he was sleeping on a stranger's couch. He asked Emily what they were doing. She told him he ought to go home. Of course, Kitsch Boy didn't last. The summer arrived, and Emily returned to Dania. She and Ford reconciled. It was the summer of '96, but it felt like they time traveled back to their first meeting on the beach. Only they managed to stretch that feeling the entire 12 weeks. They talked about marriage and kids and the places they would go and the things they'd see and all the other stuff you say during the summer when nothing is quite as real as the fall, winter, and spring. When Emily returned to Gainesville, so too did her impatience and dissatisfaction. This time around, though, her focus broadened. It didn't apply exclusively to Ford, but to everyone, particularly herself. Nevertheless, they managed to make it to winter, then spring. Do you realize how easy we have it? She asked Ford. This became Emily's mantra throughout her sophomore year. Back then, she held a general contempt for all of life's advantages, an insistence on a world unbalanced, a world corrupt, a world completely fucked. But over time, the veneer cracked. Her outrage had little to do with the system and everything to do with herself. Emily was experiencing an existential crisis. She decided to become a writer. But what exactly did she have to write about? What insights could the daughter of a litigator offer the world? Where did 6 years of horse camp fall into the sort of narrative she dreamt necessary to truly claim a voice? What inspiration did she have to draw from? What struggles had she faced? She never voiced her concerns outright. If anything, she projected her fears onto Ford. Don't you get scared, she asked. You literally don't know anything outside of Dania, and all that you do know has already happened. You'll be following in your dad's footsteps, even though you already know how that story goes. It's a family business. Only if you continue it, she said. It makes sense to. If you're looking for the easy way out, it'll benefit us both, he said. Emily fell silent. He knew then he was losing her again, only this time it felt less personal. He sensed her loss. She didn't want to lose him, but it was beyond their control. This was the final day of spring break, and they both knew it was goodbye, and so they drank a proper farewell and stumbled to the beach and fucked under the pier and listened to the waves and said silly things and laughed and cried and took turns saying pretty things to help the other one stop crying. It all felt right. Ford remembered being okay with it then, knowing that it was the end, but that they would see each other again in different lives and under different circumstances, that the transition would be the hardest part. But once they got through that, all would be fine. Emily returned in May. They hadn't spoken since their farewell night. She found him inside his father's print shop. He stood behind the counter entering payments. She remained by the door, peering out its front window onto A1A. Her face reflected off the glass. At first, her focus stayed on the traffic. Then she looked toward his reflection in the window. They stared at each other through the glass. Neither moved. She must have been deciding things. The door stood 2 feet away. Sorry, my computer just, okay. The door stood 2 feet away. Ford still didn't know what gesture he made, but whatever he'd done caused her to smile. It wasn't a broad smile by any means. If anything, it was more in her eyes than her lips. And maybe it had nothing to do with Ford. Maybe it was the fact that she'd accepted the situation. Maybe it was the smile of surrender. I'm pregnant, Emily told him. And I'll end there.
Juicy stuff.
Thank you. I had some weird thing pop up.
Is your computer okay?
Yeah, it just
You
like
can,
popped up right at the end. I was like, of course
oh,
I
okay.
can do that. Okay,
You can hear me though?
I could hear you. Yeah.
Okay. That kind of stuff happens all the time. So thank you so much for reading that. And, I love Emily so much. I just think she's this wonderful anchor in the book for
Yeah.
Ford and for the reader, because she's, I really sit with her a lot and her perspective on things. Gosh, there's so much I want to talk about. Let's talk about love first, because this is a book about love. But what I love about this book is that it's a messy love, and it's dark love, and it's almost noirish in the way that these characters are interacting, and seedy parties and that kind of thing. And I really enjoy messy love, and I like to write about disappointment and nobody getting laid when they want to and that kind of stuff.
Right.
These are things I really enjoy. So I thought we could talk a little bit about what ways do you like to use love when you're writing? And I know this is going to sound like a crazy question, but I really mean it. What is love? Like, in terms of fiction and in terms of its presence in your writing, what is love, Thomas? Tell us.
Baby, don't hurt me. Man, what is love in my writing? I think it's kind of like what you're saying. It's the difficult things it's the ugly side that I'm more interested in with love. I think it's like, I mean, speaking specifically to my book, like, I think there's still this strange love between Ford and Emily, his ex-wife. And I think there's definitely kind of just this lingering sense, like Ford is still very much attached to her in a strange way. And that was something I was certainly interested in exploring throughout the book. I think Emily might be my favorite character in the whole novel. So it's just, yeah, what is love? I mean, love is all the painful, joyful, also happy, sad, ugly moments where you see a person at their worst and you're still pulling for them, maybe, like, I think that's what, to an extent, love is: recognizing a person's deep flaws and still finding that little gem within them that reminds you of what it was about them in the first place that kind of keeps that thing going, or doesn't, to a large extent. Like, I think, like, a lot of these characters, I mean, also Grace and JR. Grace is the love interest, JR is her estranged husband. Like, just the difficulties of their relationship. Love is complicated, I guess, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yeah, I just think it's, that's really hopeful. And I think it's great to talk about this, because, it's supposed to be this, y'all are going to hear my cat whining in the background. It's just, that's who my cat is, not getting enough love, apparently. But we think of it as this kind of, I don't want to say cliche, but this kind of grand theme in literature, but we never talk about it when we talk about craft. And this is a book that deals with it so effectively. And I think for me as a reader, what you're doing is you've found a way to, because these are often in many ways unsympathetic characters. These are people making some bad choices a lot of the time, but it humanizes them, the way that they're so desperately seeking each other, and the way that you describe them touching one another, and that longing that everyone seems to share in this book is so fascinating. And I think that it kind of infuses into some of the technical aspects of the book too. One of the things I really like about the book is how well and how tightly you sit in scenes with characters. So I don't know if this is a good segue, but you don't have love scenes, but you have these really powerful scenes between people. And I'm interested in how you, I'm interested in your scene work, right? Like, so one of my mentors, Elizabeth McCracken, says that at some point you have to get all your characters together and have a party. And this book starts that way.
Yeah.
And then it's just a mess from then on, like an emotional mess that you want to keep reading about. So talk about, like, what kind of scenes you enjoy writing and and how you think about where is the beginning and ending of a scene between two people.
Yeah. I think obviously you've read the book, like I love writing dialogue a lot, which is something I struggled with for a long time because I was at Tin House and Tom Grimes was speaking and it was a great talk, but he mentioned somewhere during his talk about like, if you write too much dialogue, maybe you're a playwright. And I was like, I'm not a playwright, I'm a novelist. But then and I like play guitar. And when I was a kid, I played punk rock. And then I met people who could play like lead guitar. And I'm like, oh, I don't play real guitar. I just play punk rock chords. Like I'm not a real guitarist. So it took me a while to just be like, you know what? Like I like writing dialogue. I don't think I lean on it too much, but I do like those interactions. But to answer your question, yeah, some of my favorite scenes in the book, maybe just because I've read it and rewrote it and so many times, but it's between like Ford and there's kind of like 3 interactions at the beginning, middle, and end where he's talking to essentially a stranger. And that's when he becomes almost most open, and you kind of get a sense like that's what he's always chasing, this way to reveal something about himself to somebody of no consequence because there's no attachments there and no risk. But I feel like those particular scenes, when I revisit them, when I'm like looking through for passages to read, I'm like, oh, that's actually a really sweet scene. So like the one in particular that jumps out through your question is the one with, my wife's gonna kill me, but Noir, I pronounce it wrong, but she's not a stripper, she's the cocktail waitress at Eden's, which is the strip club that takes place in a couple of chapters. And yeah, she's kind of telling Ford how they obviously know each other, and you get that through the dialogue. There's like banter right away to cue readers in, like this is a place Ford comes to a lot. They've developed this relationship, and that scene in particular was kind of fun and not easy to write, but like it's a big like there's literally like a small story within that exchange where they're reunited because Ford's been MIA for a while. She's revealing to him in that moment that she's pregnant and she's leaving town. The next day, they have this kind of exchange outside where they're smoking, and he's smoking her cigarette in part because he thinks he's doing a favor to the kid. And then they have this brief kiss, and they have this nice little exchange where like she's kind of just spilling her guts to him about all of her fears, and he's listening. I think it's a moment where you see Ford's like softer side, which is strange because it is with a stranger, but you see like, all right, this is like a person who's capable of empathy, and he does on some level care about people, and he understands the struggles. And they have this nice little exchange where she keeps asking him questions to make her feel better, and he keeps just saying whatever she needs to hear. And I don't know how I knew when the scene ended, other than it kind of ends out like it's a lot of dialogue, but then it ends on that really, for me, I think it's just a sad note that it's something like he felt bad, she was a sweet girl, and he felt bad to know nothing good would ever come her way. And that just, like, I don't know if I'm answering your question, other than like you kind of just, you obviously don't want to extend a scene too long. Like the opening chapter, actually, during the 2020, when I was revising the novel before publication, like that was, I think, like 35 pages. I shaved off like 10 pages because I was letting some of the scenes go for too long, and like I was missing. I was getting a little too caught up in the fun of writing some of it, where I was like, they're kind of hitting the same notes over and over again. They're not really, it's not developing anything. It's too much banter. So yeah, as far as where to start, I think the best, I mean, this is what a lot of writers say, but like, you put a draft down, you come back to it a couple months later with fresh eyes, and a scene will jump out when it's like, okay, I'm bored reading this at this point. Like it's dragging on too long. What could I get rid of? Who can I kill off? Who could I get rid of for this scene? And that was actually how, I mean, the party that the novel starts on was actually at one point the middle of the book. And then my buddy Tyson Morgan, another writer, he just kept insisting. He's like, dude, your story starts at this party and it really takes off after that. You got to get rid of all this stuff. And I was like, I don't know, man. That's a lot of words to lose. And he was like, it'll be for the best. Trust me. And eventually, many drafts later, yeah.
Well, and we should say, like, these are issues that you fixed, right? Because the scenes do. You're talking about previous drafts and the process, right, which I appreciate and which I think is so important. But in terms of, so readers understand, like, what I'm getting at is that these are scenes where we come in not at the beginning and we leave before it gets boring, right? Like we zip in and we zip out. And I think what's so interesting also about this book is, even though it does have like this this messy and juicy plot line, what this really is about characters. And rather than getting to know Ford through action, we get to know him through interaction. And like all these minor characters like Noir, you're talking about the way he speaks to those people and expresses vulnerability, even to strangers, and the way that people speak back to him. And like, your secondary and tertiary characters are like Lenny's telling him how the world works and he's not listening, and those are I think fascinating and really, and they give the book moves because of that, because I don't think you have too much dialogue at all. I think it chips along, and I'm I'm in the scene then, and I'm, as a reader, I think people will be like, yeah, what he said, and be part of it. So I think that's so effective. And I think it's also interesting, just to kind of move on to a different subject, that so you have all these scenes, but then place is so important as well. And so let's talk about Asheville, because we're at Malaprops, and you live in Asheville, and I live in the Asheville area now, but I lived in Asheville for many years. Ford is drawn to this place. This is, you're documenting people who kind of come here to feel something or to find something. So tell me what it is, because you're not originally from Asheville, are you?
No, my parents grew up here. I always say that to get a little more cred, but no, I grew up in South Florida.
Right. So what is it about Asheville, and we can talk about Texas a little too if we have time, but what is it about Asheville that makes it, because I write about it all the time too. Why are we writing about it so much?
Yeah.
What is that about? Because I love writing about the city.
I think what you're saying to an extent is part of it. Like, people come here to start over. They see there's like, I don't know, it feels like obviously somebody online, when I posted something early on about my book, they're like, oh, how original, a Floridian moves to Asheville. That's really creative. And I'm like, thanks.
Yeah, but but that's why it's interesting, because that's a perspective that we don't, I haven't read a book about a Floridian who comes to Asheville. And what is that, because I'm writing about people who've been here for far too long and need to get their asses out, right? You're writing about somebody who's coming here,
right?
Or lots of people who are coming here. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's just like, so that's kind of an interesting component where it's just like, yeah, it feels like when you talk to a lot of people who are moving here, who are visiting here, this feel like there's a feeling to Asheville, at least in my experience. It feels there's something has been pulling me here always. And I feel like a lot of people have that, but then like once you're here long enough, it kind of starts to chip away and you're like, oh, right, this is a little different than what I naively thought it was. And I kind of feel like certainly Ford Ford has a number of reasons why he comes to Asheville that get kind of revealed throughout the novel. He kind of tells different stories in a weird way. But yeah, but then also like the story, when it began as a short story, again, this was a Boswell class. It was a very different story. And the way Boz teaches is really interesting for this forms class, where like each week you're adding a new component and you're like pulling from your own life, and then you're completely, building off of that, but not using your experiences. So it took place in Asheville specifically for that short story, but then it worked when it became a novel and it became something completely different. And I don't know, also not to sound hokey, but like on a subconscious level, because like I was talking to Allie Marshall, local writer here, artist, and she mentioned a similar thing about like, like it seemed like a good move to place it in Asheville for what this character's going through. And I was like, yeah, now that you're saying it, yeah, it makes even more sense that he's in Asheville. But sometimes it wasn't like too strategic, like in that way. But I also needed these characters to be moving away from each other, from Florida up to Asheville, and then
Right.
Ford's family is gradually going up the coast of Florida before hopping over to California. So I
Right.
just wanted great distance, and geographical, just, like Florida versus obviously Western North Carolina, you can't get much different. So just the sense of this guy is completely trying to start over. And in an earlier draft also, like, sorry to keep talking about earlier drafts, but like,
It's okay.
Ford was like almost trying to like, just like cut himself off from the ocean completely because his son is.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, the topography, and the geography of the places where people are coming from and going to, I think it sort of reflects what their struggles are or what their problems are, or, like to go back to Texas and Grace's marriage is complicated, and to deal with those complications in a place like Texas, not to spoil anything, but that, she's adding to her lot in doing that, so yeah, it's really interesting how you chose geography for that.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Texas then for a minute, because I love Texas and I did a lot of writing in Texas, and I'm an Austin person. I lived in Austin. You lived in Houston, right?
Yep.
So what's I don't know, where's the Texas in this? Figuratively or literally, what's the Texas in you or in this book?
Yeah. I guess just because I like Grace, I think it's pretty super, like, Grace and her husband come from this wealthy family where they've kind of had, she can obviously leave Houston without any concerns, and JR can do the same thing. He could, lose his job as a radio host, and still be fine. And I guess living in Houston, I just associated great wealth with Houston because of the oil industry, and like driving around some of those neighborhoods is just like, oh my gosh. So yeah, I definitely wanted two people out of their element. So that's why, like, they're both coming, Ford's from Florida, she's from Texas, they're both in the mountains. But I think ultimately it was just like, I was familiar with Houston to an extent as well, or I was familiar with Houston. So it just felt like, yeah, I want them to, be coming from locations that are fairly similar also, like Houston versus South Florida. I mean, there's some clear differences, but yeah, I wanted them to have similar backgrounds. I wanted them both to have exposure and time at the beach, for certain chapters and reasons and scenes. But yeah, I think it was truly just, going to River Oaks in Houston for the holidays and looking at all the Christmas lights at the mansions and thinking, I could see this character, I could see her family.
Yeah,
let's
talk. So I will say just before, because I really want to talk about this idea of the wealth and of these characters. So, but first, let me say that just as a reader, one of the things I appreciate is being a person from Texas, or not from Texas, but who's lived in Texas and who loves it, is Texas is, you get a lot of real talk when you go to Texas. And there's, like, people are honest with each other in this book in a way that's really refreshing. And I think that's why the dialogue works, so if you need a little bit of that Texas zing where, because a lot of books you read them and you think, well, if they would just talk about it, like but then this book, they talk about it, so that's really refreshing. And I thought maybe that was a result of having been around so many real talkers in Texas who will tell you exactly what you need to hear when you least want to hear it.
Yeah, like the Bethany character I really loved, but she's in the beginning, the first chapter, and she's a friend coming from Houston. And she's one of those 3 conversations in the novel with a stranger. Her character was very different early on. She was pretty rough and like very unsympathetic, and I kind of love her character too, actually.
I do too, yeah.
But my buddy Chase was like, dude, she was just hard to read. And when he said that, I was like, well, this is the beginning of the book. Like, I need to think about this, like, so I changed her quite a bit. But yeah, she's one that kind of just lays it all out and tells it like it is. And yeah, there's a couple of those scenes with the Texans that I love. The scenes that happen in Texas when Grace goes to Galveston. That's one of my favorite little sections. And that was,
so sorry, were you finished?
oh, I was just going to say that was late in the game too, that particular scene.
Well, because we're talking about place and this, because you mentioned, the fact that Grace is coming from such a wealthy neighborhood, and there's that scene when I can't remember when it happens, but where Ford is kind of, one of the nice things about this book is it isn't fully linear, like we bounce back and forth, when he met Grace after they, haven't seen each other for a while, when they were married, before they met, all this kind of stuff. And it's not difficult to follow at all. It really works. But one scene that's sort of early is, and there's a couple of moments like this in the book where people are kind of talking to each other and they're referring to their own privilege. And somebody says to Ford, we're a bunch of rich white babies in a Lexus.
That was to Grace.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. So I found this so interesting because of because the book is set in Asheville and because of the references to Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. And I wondered I wanted to ask you about influence. Like, who is influencing this book? Are you mirroring Fitzgerald? Is there some Gatsby stuff going on here? Because you have characters who are kind of trying to sort out their ennui and their emotional hangups despite having a lot of privilege.
Right.
So is Fitzgerald in there, or who are your influences with this?
Yeah, I mean, Gatsby is my favorite book, and it's my favorite book because the first time I read it was in high school. And my high school AP English teacher, I don't know what he saw in me, but he was always interested in my thoughts. And we had to read it over the summer. And he's like, well, what'd you think of Gatsby? And I was like 17. And I was like, I don't know, man, like nothing happens in this book. And he's like, are you kidding me? Everything happens in this book. And I don't remember what everything was that he told me in that conversation, but I remember feeling this great shame and just like, oh my gosh, I'm an idiot. I don't understand life. I suck. And that book haunted me for a while, but then it kept coming up. And, when I was at UF, I studied English. I read Gatsby 2 or 3 times in college, then in graduate school. And now it's one of those books that I just read basically once a year. And I write Gatsby poems, which are kind of fun. So that's definitely a huge influence. And yeah, like Fitzgerald, I worked for a bit at the Thomas Wolfe Memorial. And obviously there's the connection between Wolfe and Fitzgerald as well.
Right. And Zelda was here for a long time.
Yeah. And, there's just so many connections that have kind of just deepened my kind of obsession, because I've read bios on Wolfe, on Fitzgerald, on Zelda. I don't live too far from Beaver Lake, which is where Fitzgerald dislocated his shoulder in 1936. So yeah, Fitzgerald, I think, would be up there. He's far more lyrical than I am as a writer, but I think I was definitely channeling some of that. And then the story was in first person originally, and there were a couple of novels that I was kind of I've been obsessed with, like The Remains of the Day, in particular. And then like I read a lot of Hemingway when I was younger. Still do, I suppose. But I think Fitzgerald for sure has been kind of like, every writer has that one that they're like super obsessed with. And I think not his entire collection either. Like I'm pretty just set on, like, I've read everything, but Gatsby's the one that I keep coming back to.
Yeah, it's a real undersong in the book. Like if you know the city, especially, you really pick up on it. And it's just kind of this background music, as you're reading, that I really enjoyed, which is great. Which reminds me, let's talk about music, because this is, and I don't know if anybody heard that, but the music of my cat's whining. So it's the music in your book. So this is hugely important to Ford, and there's basically a soundtrack to this book, because
Yeah.
there's so many references to music, and he's thinking about music as he's making his art. So I'm curious if you had, because we're talking about influences, when you're writing, do you listen to music? Is there a playlist for this book? What were you listening to? Like, tell us about music and how it figures in the book or how it figures in your own process.
Yeah, I definitely don't listen to music when I write. It's pretty much just, I can't, because I end
Yeah, I
up just
can't either.
I just listen.
I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah, I can't do
I
it.
was reading this like, oh, this is somebody who knows how to write with music on.
Yeah, I can't do that.
I have to listen.
There is a playlist. Large Hearted Boy is going to publish it soon.
Cool.
But yeah, it's funny because I'm obsessed with the band The Walkmen. Like, just, and so everybody who knows me is like, all right, I wonder how many Walkman references are in the book, and there's none, because I just felt like that's too close, that's too real. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, Arcade Fire, The Suburbs is huge in this novel. That's Ford is working on a collage. He for obviously folks who haven't read the book, he makes collages based usually on a single song, but for his son's birthday, he's going to do the entire Arcade Fire, The Suburbs album. And that was intentional just because, like, The Suburbs thematically really, fits in with the book. And then another one of those crazy things during the multiple revisions, like at one point, Grace's painting collage was not really on the page, and like, it's crucial, obviously. But hers was based on an actual band, and initially when it didn't really factor into the story, but once I wanted to pull that up, I wanted to fictionalize it, because I kind of, there's no real logic to it, but I like blending, like real and fiction, the real bands, fictional bands. But also, like, I did want to hit on a specific kind of theme for her work as well, kind of the suburbs, the wasteland. But then, yeah, music in general certainly comes up, and a ton throughout this book. Bob Dylan, Springsteen, trying to think of some of the others that get mentioned, but I'm like,
do you want readers to be hearing that music, or is it just part, because maybe this is a different question, art and creativity is so important to so many people in this book, and important in Asheville, like, Ford's in the River Arts District, that kind of stuff. Like, well, do you want readers to be thinking about music and creative space and the creative impulse as they're reading, or is that, like,
to a certain extent, yeah. And then also, I feel like certain songs, like, if you read the book and then you listen to this, like, this is, no one's gonna actually do this, and I don't expect you to, but like, there is something just like that's cool, that if like this became your Gatsby, where you're obsessed with it and you read it compulsively, like, there are just some interesting parallels between certain songs and certain scenes that, like, I think I'm also obsessed with The Sopranos, and I've watched that series way too many times. And David Chase in music, he's doing all these layered things, like, where he's not just simply playing the music that's echoing the scene, it's adding something more to it. And I think on some level I was trying to create something like that. Obviously, the difference between, film and TV versus literature is the reader is not hearing that, versus the audience watching the show gets to actually hear it. But I did think, like, on some level, it adds a texture, it adds a layer. And then, yeah, the creative space, I just feel like no matter what medium you're working in, like, I did want people, and I think most, a lot of people are creative, whether it's what they do professionally or if it's something they do on the side, a hobby, whatever. Like, I think a lot of people can recognize that kind of energy you get from whatever your creative outlet is. And I think that's really important for Ford's character to see that in the novel when it happens, to be like, right, you're in that flow, you're in that zone, like, this is all that matters. And that's, like, I feel like what a lot of artists are chasing, writers, visual artists, filmmakers, musicians, like, you're chasing just that present moment, just the present tense, where you're just completely in it, and it's just a good feeling.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that goes back to what we were saying about love. Well, so you're chasing that moment. Are you chasing that moment as an artist? Why is this your first book? Why now? Why is it coming out now? Why is this your debut? What made you facing with this book for yourself?
I'm really glad this is my debut. I had a couple of other books I wrote during undergrad and graduate school that I'm really happy never came out. I'm so happy they never came out. But I don't like, I think I came to a point, well, I don't think there's any wasted time when you're doing something that your creative calling. So like, I don't look back on those 3 novels that never got published as like, oh, I wasted 10 years working on 3 things.
Yeah,
No, like they all built on to this. And I think all those 3 helped make this book. The book couldn't have happened without those 3 books, I don't think.
Right.
And
yeah, you have a blurb from George Singleton, whom I love George, and George famously says that you need to write 1,000 pages before you're a writer. So maybe that's what those 2 first books are.
George is hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's, so why this book? I think just because, like I put this book down for a while. I was working on another book, and Unsolicited reached out to me, and I was pretty deep into this other book, and I was really digging it, and it's totally different. Like, and I was like, you got to be shitting me, because I've been trying, I've been trying to land this book somewhere for a while. And when they messaged me, I was like, this is going to be another heartbreak. Like, I'm going to submit the novel. I'm going to hear from them in like 10 years, and they're going to tell me no. So I was just very nonchalant. My response was like, I don't even know what version I sent you. Like, I don't know what you're even asking for now at this point. The story's changed. And they're like, just send us what you're happy with. We just want to review it. And when it happened, you reach that point where you just don't, you're like, there must be something wrong with these people. But so
there's been a clerical error.
Yeah. So that's all to say, like this particular book, I definitely am interested the older I get in the creative process, and like on every level. Like I love watching documentaries on chefs. Like I love and photographers, people who are really passionate about whatever they do. Skateboarders, surfers too. Like it's just like fascinating to me, like the people who devote their lives to those kinds of things. And I think that's what I wanted. Bailey, the son in here, is a semi-pro surfer going pro, like, and obviously his mother and stepfather, they've readjusted their entire life for him. He's kind of a prick, but he's also like really passionate about surfing, also maybe fame. But yeah, I just wanted to
savvy for such a young guy.
Oh, savvy. Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to explore people who have the potential to get in that, but also have the potential to, lose themselves outside of the good. There's a lot of good that comes from the creative process, and also obviously some bad.
Oh, I see Patricia. Hello.
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 I just dropped back in, so don't mind me. But I would love to pose some questions and see what you 2 come up with.
Sure.
Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Right. Well, you were kind of already on this, Thomas, and I think it would be lovely to hear from the 2 of you about how did you get this book published? I would love to hear, how does one do it? Tell us the secrets.
That was going to be my next question, and you started to answer it. Yeah, go ahead.
10 years of rejection, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of self-loathing. And then you forget about it. You let it go. You're okay with it. Like with this book, I was like, I'm putting it down. I'm happy with it. If anything ever occurs, I've got this one. So I'm working on this other one, but I'll have this other one, in the bag if the opportunity arises. And that's what happened. I kind of just forgot, because I'd been reaching out to agents, and some had like asked for additional pages, passed. And then I started submitting to some smaller presses, and I completely forgot, because it was like a pretty significant amount of time had passed. I forgot I submitted it to Unsolicited.
And they're based in Oregon?
They're based in Portland, Oregon. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a cool town. More novels need to be written about Portland too.
Yeah.
That was a question from a former student friend of mine, Hannah Epperson. So she wants to know, she's a writer as well. And Leah, what about you? How did you get Fuckface published?
Yeah, well,
This is a great
slowly
collection.
Also, slowly also. What was your friend's name, Patricia, who asked the question?
Hannah.
Hannah. It's, we started this conversation talking about love, and I think finding a publisher is kind of like finding love. Got to kiss some frogs. You got to get rejected, and then it happens. I had a little bit of a different path because I was at the Michener Center in Austin, Texas for a few years, and while I was there, I won a little contest thing, won an award for something that I'd done, which then got the interest of an agent who contacted me. And then, so when I finished that book, I already had representation. And then it was this incredibly nerve-wracking process of going out on sub to publishers. And I'm like, I used to teach at a community college. Like, I can handle a rough crowd. I'm not, you don't shake me very easily. Like, I'm one of those people who, like, I can handle it if I read my Goodreads reviews. It doesn't hurt my feelings. And, but wow, that process where like all these big important people in New York are reading your book, I was in the fetal position for a week. It was just, oh my God, it's so terrible. Everything's so terrible. But it worked out, and somebody was okay with calling it fuckface, and it got published. So and I was very happy with my editor, and it's been a good I've been really happy with Holt. So yeah, but it's like falling in love.
Well, Thomas has told us all about that, right? So that's so glad that you asked him to define, give us the definition. So now we're ready.
Right.
Living in Asheville, there's that saying, only in Asheville.
Oh yeah.
Right. You drive down the road, it's like, oh my God, only in Asheville. Yeah. And so Tracy Rose says, first of all, can't wait to
read Tracy.
Hi, Tracy.
Sorry, go ahead.
Point. Enthusiasm. And Thomas, are there any only in Asheville moments to look for?
Chapters 1, 2, 3.
There's 14 chapters. There's certainly, I'm trying to think of specifics.
While you do that, I'll give you a little thinking room there, and I'm going to jump to Texas so you can think about Asheville for just a moment. I lived in Texas too, and I lived to tell. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as y'all were talking about Texas was I live in the Panhandle, just south of Amarillo, and I discovered Texas Monthly, and I love the Bum Steer Awards. So I had to post that in the chat because there's nothing like Bum Steer Awards, and I want. So only in Asheville is kind of like a little bit of a brand, of the, oh man, only in
Asheville needs to have something like that, because the Bum Steer Awards are, yeah, man. Because I said, like, you will get some real talk in Texas, and you will find out if you blew a raspberry.
You will.
I love Texas Monthly. It's just a fantastic magazine, and you don't need to like Texas things to subscribe to Texas Monthly. It's
so true.
It's just incredible.
So Thomas, did I buy you a little time there?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, gentrification isn't only happening in Asheville, but like the River Arts District, the transformation, the fact that like, I'm never specific about where Ford is, because honestly, there's like a couple of spots where I was like, oh, I could see Ford in that building, but I didn't want to define it. But there's the quirky little, former manufacturing spot turned art studios, turned new owner, turns half the place into restaurants, and they buy
our rent is going to go up. That's the thing that got me, was how he kept talking about how his rent was going to go up in his studio, and then not even knowing. That's Asheville.
Yeah. The naming of some of the studios and how they're not even and then like the only in Asheville, this isn't really like, I know this isn't the only in Asheville kind of the meaning of it, but like, like there's scenes that take place at the Grove Park Inn. There's certainly some, you can only go to the Grove Park Inn in Asheville. But otherwise, no, I kind of feel like, Yeah, no, there's plenty of only in Asheville
We
moments.
should mention too, Annette Clapsaddle's book, Even as We Breathe, which takes place, a large part of that takes place at the Grove Park. So if people have interest in the Grove Park, Thomas's book and Annette's book, both of which Malaprops have, she's a wonderful writer from Cherokee. And I just realized that you said Tracy Rose, and I have a friend named Tracy Rose, but I don't know if the person who's here tonight watching is my friend Tracy Rose. So if it's just another Tracy Rose, hello to you too, or my friend, hello.
It's Tracy from Mountain Express. The opinions.
Oh, so that's not my Tracy.
Okay. I was like, oh, cool. You know Tracy too?
No, I don't. But I'll be friends with you too. Then I have two friends named Tracy Rose. How cool would that be?
Very cool, Leah. That would be very cool. So now, Thomas, you do a lot of different kinds of writing, and you do nonfiction. You know, you're a man of many areas of writing. You cross genres, right? Let's call it that. So do you have to like do a palate cleanser, a writing palate cleanser to get ready to go into like nonfiction versus fiction? How do you do it?
Well, the nonfiction is exclusive to work, I think. So I just, I compare it to like, well, I think of them as just two different things, it's like cross country versus sprint. And there's the added pressure with work related stuff. It's just a different beast. And like fiction to me is kind of like, just heaven. And nonfiction is a more strict deadline. And, I mean, a lot of times I get to write what I'm interested in. Sometimes I'm taking on things to help out. So yeah, I cleanse just with a big cup of coffee at night to write fiction. And then I just sit in my red chair and I write and I feel really good.
Do you think the discipline carries over? Because I found having taught English for a long time and having been a tech writer, that I think at least in first and final draft, maybe not in the middle, but in first and final draft, I think I work with a little more precision than most people. And I would imagine you do too, where you've got more of an exacting eye than, a lot of people have to bring somebody in for help with that end process. And I would imagine that you didn't, because you're churning out so much content already that you kind of know how to self-edit already. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I do think I'm a pretty good self-editor, especially with fiction. Like I know how to be harsh. I think my editors at Express have helped. I mean, but also like I think too, like grad school, you grow a thick skin and you start to recognize your flaws and you're not offended. You're just like, right, I am a deeply flawed person, writer, and like you grow from that.
Sure.
But yeah, I think shaping stories is pretty easy for me. The discipline I think carried over from fiction, because I'm pretty disciplined when it comes to writing fiction, pretty regimented, and it's been different since the book came out and doing more of the marketing stuff, which is a whole different thing. But yeah, I'm pretty self-disciplined, so that's never been like a struggle to sit down and write. I love it, even when I hate it.
Well, you dropped a little tantalizing tidbit when you mentioned that you write Gatsby poems.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, piqued some interest. And I definitely want to make sure. Andrew Clark says, Thomas, you said you write Gatsby poems, which raises a ton of questions. But do you write poetry regularly or as a gateway to your prose?
Yeah, no, I don't write poetry regularly. Gatsby poems, like in between drafts, you obviously should take a break to kind of just come at it with a fresh pair of eyes. When I don't write, I get really anxious. So in between drafts, usually I would write Gatsby poems, and I just made a game out of it and I was just mailing them off to friends, where it was basically a way to explore Fitzgerald's book in a different way. But it's one line from each chapter in chronological order. Once you select a line, there's no going back. So you gotta just keep going. and it creates these beautiful collaborations where I feel like, I feel like I'm collaborating in some weird way with Fitzgerald, and it just is such a fun way to see what you could come up with. And it always seemingly works out, like the poem feels like something other, like it's Gatsby, but it's otherly. It's just a really fun thing to do. And I recommend it. I'm trying to get an essay published about this. I recommend it for any book you love. Like, it's a fun way to engage with a book in a totally different way. So yeah, that's the only poetry I write, Gatsby poems.
That's really interesting. I do not write Gatsby poems. I just write normal poems.
Yeah.
I think that's often how I work out characters, is voicing, the speaker and working through it in poems. So yeah, that's often a first draft for me.
So you start with poems.
Not always, but I like when I'm writing fiction, I read poetry.
Yeah.
And I really love writing poetry, and I haven't published much of it. I have tons of it, and I don't know what to do with any of it. But I find, and I really like poetry workshops, and it just feels like this open playground where I can just kind of mess around, very low stakes, and a lot of times I'll figure out like how someone speaks, or what what the turn is for somebody, where their hurt is, that kind of stuff from writing poetry. So yeah. I don't know.
That's awesome. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, I really enjoy it.
Poets are so much cooler than fiction writers, I think.
Well,
every poet I meet, I'm like, you're cool.
I mean, I think they throw better parties. I don't know if they're cooler than me.
Absolutely. But you're a poet as well, so that's why you're cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you two are kind of talking about poetry that helps you, and I have to give a little shout out to Walter Mosley.
Mm-hmm.
He had a new book here recently, Blood Grove, and he was on, and this is his book, Elements of Fiction, and he has a little chapter about poetry is how you learn rhythm, how you learn to express yourself succinctly. So I just have to say Walter Mosley is in there with you too.
Good.
So Thomas, the inevitable, what's next? And I mean this in two very specific ways, because we have a question, like, are you coming to Houston? Question, right?
Yeah.
From Jose Leal. He says, are you coming to Houston for a book signing? And then that means also, what's next big? Like, are you working on something else?
Yeah, I'm legally not allowed to go back to Texas until 2020. No, I would love to go to Houston for a reading once this pandemic is completely gone. I would love to. I would love to get back there and see all my people, including Jose. And then, yeah, again, I was working on a novel. When Unsolicited reached out about this one. So second draft in, it's a very different novel. It takes place in the 30s in Asheville. Big cast of characters, kind of the close third, but shifting perspectives each chapter. And I'm pretty pumped to get back into that whenever that is. I think it's going to be a little longer before I can, but that's what I'm working on. You're muted, Patricia.
I clicked the wrong button. I was just about to be like, whatever. Okay, well, I want to say, I want to give you and Leah the last words, and then I'll kind of just do a little shout out for independent bookstores. So final gems, final thoughts.
I just want to thank Leah and Malaprops again. Honestly, Fuckface, I've bought this for a few people for Christmas. It's such a good collection. And I mean, we hit on similar themes as far as just like, love, divorce, sexual trauma, like, and your book is just like, the tone was perfect. And just your the amount of research that went into so many of your stories was just incredibly impressive. So thank you guys. This was awesome. I really appreciate it. And I'm thankful to everybody who came out to listen. And I hope everybody who reads the book enjoys it. Thank you guys again.
Thank you, and thanks for asking me to do this, Thomas. I was really flattered, and I'm flattered by what you said about the book, and I just enjoyed your work so much. And so thanks to Malaprops as always. And yeah, imagine a loved one opening a gift that says first fuckface, and then underneath that in the box is the wind under the door, which could mean anything. It could be a fart, it could be a breeze of love, and it's all about Asheville. You know, put some like local, like some Imladris farm jam in there. Send somebody their Asheville care package with these two
Poppy's
boxes of Malaprop.
popcorn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're so delighted, Thomas, with your debut novel, The Wind Under the Door. We want to thank you for being with us, you and Leah. We know that Emeka, our founder, really had a vision that Malaprops would be a place where people would gather. And even though we're doing it virtually, that doesn't mean anything has changed as far as that mission. And so we're so glad that you joined us this evening, and we hope to see you in the store. Get your vaccine, right? And stay safe, everyone. We want to thank you all for being here this evening and supporting Thomas and The Wind Under the Door. Have a great night.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.